Imagine living in a house where men sit around a table arguing that all people are born free, while you stand just a few feet away as their slave. That was the life of Elizabeth Freeman, a woman who couldn't read, couldn't write, and had spent nearly 30 years in chains. But one day, she heard something that changed everything. Words written by powerful men. All men are born free and equal. So she asked a question that shocked everyone. If that's true, why am I still a slave? What she did next was unthinkable. In 1781, she sued her master. And the result didn't just change her life, it helped destroy slavery in an entire state. In the middle of the 18th century, somewhere in the British colonies of North America, a child was born into a life that was never meant to be her own. There was no celebration, no official record. No one wrote down the exact day she came into the world. History would later remember her as Elizabeth Freeman, but at the time, she was known by a much simpler name, Bett. She was born into slavery sometime in the mid-1740s, most likely around the spring of 1744. The exact place of her birth remains uncertain, but historians believe it was somewhere in New York Colony, long before the land would become part of the United States. In those years, slavery was woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life in the northern colonies. Many Americans today imagine slavery as something that existed only in the plantations of the South. But in the 1700s, enslaved people lived and worked throughout the North as well, in farms, houses, and small towns scattered across the colonies. Bett was born on a farm owned by a man named Peter Hogaboom in a rural area called Claverack, located in what is now Columbia County, New York. The Hogaboom family had Dutch roots. Their ancestors had arrived decades earlier, during the days when New York was still known as New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony on the edge of a growing empire. By the time Bett was born, the land had already changed hands. The British had taken control, and New Amsterdam had become New York. But one thing had not changed. Slavery remained. On the Hogaboom farm, enslaved men and women worked long hours tending fields, maintaining buildings, and serving inside the household. They had no legal rights. Their lives were controlled entirely by the people who claimed to own them. Bett entered that world the moment she was born. Like most enslaved children, she inherited her status from her mother. Under colonial law, the child of an enslaved woman was automatically a slave, no matter who the father was. It was a system designed to ensure that slavery would reproduce itself, generation after generation. And so Bett's life was decided before she even opened her eyes. Very little is known about her earliest years. No letters survive, no diary entries, no childhood memories written in her own words. In fact, Bett never learned to read or write. That was not unusual for enslaved people in the 18th century. Literacy was often denied to them intentionally. Knowledge was power, and power was something slave owners rarely wished to share. What historians know about Bett's early life comes from fragments, later recollections, family records, and stories passed down by people who knew her long after her life had already changed the course of history. From those fragments, a picture slowly emerges. The Hogaboom household was not a small one. Several enslaved people lived and worked there, forming a quiet community bound together by circumstance and survival. Among them was a girl named Lizzie. Lizzie was Bett's sister. The two girls likely grew up side by side, sharing the same cramped spaces, the same exhausting routines, and the same uncertain future. No one knows what happened to their parents. In many enslaved families, parents and children were separated early in life, sold, transferred, or sent to work in different households. Sometimes, they lived on the same property but rarely had the freedom to build anything resembling a normal family life. Bett and Lizzie grew up in a world where the people they loved could disappear at any moment. Childhood, for enslaved children, ended quickly. From an early age, Bett would have been expected to work. Small tasks at first, carrying water, gathering wood, helping in the kitchen. As she grew older, the responsibilities would increase. Every day was structured around labor, Wake before sunrise. Work until evening. Sleep only long enough to repeat it all again the next day. This was simply how the world worked, or at least, that is how it seemed. But even as a child, Bett showed signs of something unusual, a quiet strength that others would later remember clearly. Those who described her years later spoke of a woman who carried herself with an unmistakable sense of dignity. She was not loud, not reckless, but she possessed a stubborn independence. It was a quality that would eventually change everything. For now, however, Bett was just a young girl growing up on a colonial farm, surrounded by people who believed her life belonged to them. She had no idea that one day she would challenge that belief in a courtroom. She had no idea that her name would one day be written into American history. And she certainly had no idea that the words freedom and law would someday become the weapons she used to break the chains she was born into. For the moment, Bett was simply another enslaved child in colonial New York, invisible to the world beyond the farm. But history has a strange way of turning the most overlooked lives into the most powerful stories, and Bett's story was only beginning. For Bett, childhood did not feel like childhood. There were no carefree days, no schoolrooms, no sense that life might hold different possibilities. From the time she was strong enough to carry a bucket, she was expected to work. That was simply the rule for enslaved children in the colonies. Morning usually came before the sun. The farm would slowly come alive in the gray light of dawn. Doors creaked open, boots hit the dirt. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the air as fires were lit for cooking. Bett and the other enslaved children were already awake by then. Their work began early and ended late. Small hands carried water from wells, gathered firewood, and helped with chores inside the house. As the years passed, the work only grew heavier. There were floors to scrub, clothes to wash by hand, food to prepare for the household. Every task had to be done quickly and carefully, because mistakes could bring punishment. Among the people living on the Hogaboom farm, Bett was rarely alone. The enslaved community shared the same long days and the same quiet understanding of their situation. They supported each other when they could, even in small ways, a whispered word of encouragement, an extra piece of bread, a warning when the master was in a bad mood. And beside Bett, through much of her childhood, was her sister, Lizzie. The two girls likely worked side by side for many years. In a life where almost everything could be taken away, family was one of the few things that gave comfort. But even family was fragile. Enslaved families could be separated without warning. Owners sold people to settle debts, to make money, or simply to reorganize their labor. A child could wake up one morning and discover that a parent or sibling had been sent away, perhaps forever. Every enslaved person lived with that fear. Despite this harsh world, Bett developed a reputation among those around her. She was not someone who easily accepted humiliation. Even as a young girl, she carried herself with a quiet stubbornness that others noticed. She was observant. She watched the way the household worked. She listened when people spoke, and she remembered. Those habits would later prove far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. But in those early years, Bett's future still seemed fixed. She was an enslaved girl on a farm in colonial New York, growing older with each passing season, expected to spend her entire life serving the people who owned her. Then, in the early 1750s, something happened that would change the course of her life. A member of the Hogaboom family was about to marry, and with that marriage, Bett would be sent away from the only place she had ever known. In the early 1750s, a major change came to the Hogaboom household. Hannah Hogaboom, the daughter of the farm's owner, was preparing to marry a man of considerable status, Colonel John Ashley, a wealthy and influential figure in the town of Sheffield, Massachusetts. Like many marriages among prominent colonial families, the union was not only about love or companionship, it was also about property, land, and status. And in that world, enslaved people were considered part of that property. When Hannah married and prepared to move to Sheffield, she did not leave empty-handed. Among the belongings sent with her was a young, enslaved girl, Bett. She was likely only 7 or 8 years old. For Bett, the move meant leaving behind the only place she had ever known. There was no choice, no explanation, and certainly no permission asked. Her life could be relocated as easily as furniture or livestock. The journey from New York to western Massachusetts would have taken several days by wagon and horseback, moving along rough colonial roads that wound through forests and farmland. Bett had no idea what awaited her at the end of that journey. When she finally arrived in Sheffield, she stepped into a very different world. Colonel John Ashley's house was far larger and grander than the Hogaboom farm buildings she had known. Built in 1735, the Ashley house was a substantial country home, rising 2.5 stories high with many rooms inside. In the mid-18th century, a house of that size marked its owner as a man of wealth and influence. Today, that house still stands and has become a historical museum. But in Bett's time, it was not a place of history, it was a place of work. Inside the Ashley household, Bett's role became clear almost immediately. She was expected to help maintain the large home, sweeping floors, washing clothes, carrying water, and assisting with the endless domestic labor required to run such a household. Every room meant more work, more floors to scrub, more laundry to wash, more meals to prepare and clean up afterward. And unlike on a farm, where much of the labor happened outdoors, life inside a wealthy household meant constant supervision. Bett lived under the eyes of her owners every day. Over time, another familiar face from her past would also appear in the Ashley home. Her sister, Lizzie, was eventually brought there as well. For Bett, that small piece of family must have been a rare comfort in a life that offered very little stability. Yet the Ashley household would soon reveal another side, one that Bett would never forget, because within those walls lived a woman known for her harsh temper, Hannah Ashley. And before long, Bett would face a moment that would leave a mark on her body and shape the course of her life forever. By the time Bett settled into life in Sheffield, Massachusetts, the Ashley household had already become one of the most prominent homes in the town. Colonel John Ashley was a respected and powerful man in the community. Landowners, merchants, and political figures frequently visited his home. Important conversations about business, land, and colonial politics often took place around his dining table. But for the people forced to serve in that house, the experience was very different. For Bett, life inside the Ashley household meant constant labor. The house itself was large for its time, 2.5 stories tall, with multiple rooms that had to be kept clean and orderly every day. In the 18th century, maintaining such a home required enormous physical effort. There were no modern conveniences, no machines to make the work easier. Everything depended on human hands. Bett's days followed a relentless rhythm. She woke before sunrise, often when the sky outside was still dark. The first task was usually preparing the fires that heated the house and allowed food to be cooked. Wood had to be carried in from outside, the ashes from the previous day cleared away, and new flames carefully built so that the kitchen could begin its work. After that came the endless cycle of domestic chores. Floors were swept and scrubbed by hand. Heavy buckets of water had to be carried from wells or nearby streams. Laundry was washed without soap as we know it today, often by beating clothes against boards or stones. Even something as simple as preparing a meal demanded hours of work chopping wood, tending fires, grinding ingredients, and cleaning afterward. And Bett was not the only enslaved person doing this work. Several others labored inside and around the Ashley property, forming a small but tightly controlled community of enslaved workers. They rarely had time for themselves, and whatever small moments of rest they managed to steal were always uncertain. At any moment, someone might call their name and demand another task. Yet even in that harsh environment, Bett's personality began to stand out. She was not loud or openly rebellious. That would have been extremely dangerous for an enslaved person. But those who knew her later described a woman who carried herself with remarkable strength and self-respect. She did her work well, but she did not behave as though she had accepted her place in the world. There was a firmness in the way she spoke, a quiet confidence in the way she moved through the house. She did not appear frightened in the way many enslaved people were forced to be. Some people noticed it, others found it unsettling. And above all, there was one person in the house who did not tolerate anything that looked like defiance. That person was Hannah Ashley. Within the walls of the Ashley household, Hannah Ashley was known for her strict and often cruel temperament. Servants and enslaved workers alike feared her sudden anger. And before long, Bett would experience that anger in a moment so violent that it would leave a scar she carried for the rest of her life. Life in the Ashley household demanded obedience. Every order had to be followed immediately. Every mistake could bring punishment. In many homes across colonial America, enslaved people lived under the constant threat of violence from those who claimed to own them. The Ashley house was no exception. Among those who lived and worked there was Lizzie, Bett's sister. After Bett had already been serving in the household for some time, Lizzie was eventually brought there as well. For Bett, seeing a familiar face from her childhood must have offered a rare sense of comfort. But even that comfort could not protect them from the temper of Hannah Ashley. Stories about Hannah Ashley circulated long after Bett had gained her freedom. Many people who later wrote about Bett described Hannah as a harsh woman, quick to anger, and known for treating the enslaved people in her house with cruelty. One particular incident would become famous in the telling of Bett's life. It happened during an ordinary day inside the Ashley home. No one knows exactly what caused Hannah Ashley's rage that day. Perhaps a mistake in the kitchen, perhaps a task not completed quickly enough. In households like this, anger often erupted over the smallest things. Whatever the reason, Hannah Ashley suddenly turned on Lizzie. In a burst of fury, she grabbed a metal shovel that had been sitting near the fire, the kind used to move burning coals in the hearth. The metal had been heated by the flames and was dangerously hot. She raised it to strike Lizzie. For an enslaved girl, there was almost no way to defend herself in such a moment. Running away could bring worse punishment. Fighting back could mean severe beating, or even death. But before the blow landed, Bett stepped forward. Without hesitation, she placed herself between Hannah Ashley and her sister. It was an instinctive act, a decision made in a split second. The shovel came down, but instead of hitting Lizzie, it struck Bett's arm. The heated metal tore into her skin, leaving a deep and painful wound. The injury was severe enough that it left a large scar that Bett would carry for the rest of her life. For many enslaved people, such wounds were hidden whenever possible. Scars were reminders of humiliation and suffering. But Bett did something unusual. She refused to hide it. In the years that followed, she often left the scar visible. When visitors came to the Ashley house and noticed the mark, Bett would sometimes make sure they understood how it had happened. It was her quiet way of revealing the truth about what went on behind the doors of a respectable colonial household. The scar became more than a wound. It became a statement, a reminder that Bett was not someone who would simply stand aside when injustice unfolded in front of her. And though no one realized it yet, that same courage, the instinct to stand up when something was wrong, would one day push Bett to challenge a system that had controlled her entire life. But before that moment arrived, Bett's life inside the Ashley household would continue for many more years. Years filled with work, years filled with silence, and years during which the world outside the house was beginning to change in ways that would eventually reach her ears. Years passed inside the Ashley household, and Bett grew from a young girl into a woman. The routines of the house never truly changed. Each day followed the same demanding rhythm: work before sunrise, labor throughout the day, and exhaustion by nightfall. The seasons shifted outside the windows of the Ashley home, but Bett's position in the world remained exactly the same. She was still enslaved. Yet during those years, Bett experienced something that would deepen both her strength and her sense of responsibility. She became a mother. Very little is known about the father of Bett's child. Records from that time rarely preserved such details about the lives of enslaved people. Their families, relationships, and personal histories were often ignored by the society around them. According to later tradition, the man believed to be the father may have left to fight in the growing conflict that would soon become the American Revolutionary War. If that was true, he never returned. Whether that story is completely accurate or not, one thing is certain. Bett was left to raise her child while still living in slavery. For enslaved mothers, raising children carried a constant shadow of fear. A child born into slavery did not belong to their mother in the eyes of the law. Just like Bett herself, the child was considered property. At any moment, that child could be taken away, sold to another family, sent to work somewhere far away, separated forever. It was a reality that haunted countless enslaved parents throughout colonial America. Despite those fears, Bett cared for her child while continuing the demanding work required in the Ashley home. Every day she balanced two lives, the life of a servant forced to obey orders, and the life of a mother trying to protect and guide a child in a world that denied them both freedom. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the Ashley house, the colonies were beginning to stir with new ideas. Men gathered in taverns and meeting houses, discussing politics, taxes, and the power of the British Crown. Arguments about rights and liberty were spreading throughout the colonies. Those conversations reached the Ashley household as well. Colonel John Ashley was deeply involved in local political life. Important visitors often came to his home to discuss the growing tensions between the American colonies and Britain. Bett was not part of those discussions, but she heard them. As she moved through the rooms of the house, carrying water, serving food, cleaning tables, she listened. Words floated through the halls. Words like freedom, words like rights, words about how no man should be ruled unjustly. To the men speaking them, these ideas were part of a political argument about taxes and independence. But to Bett, the meaning was far more personal. Because every time she heard those words, a question must have quietly formed in her mind. If people truly believed that all human beings deserved freedom, then why was she still a slave? At the time, it was only a thought. But soon, something would happen inside the Ashley house that would turn that question into something much more powerful. By the early 1770s, the tension between the American colonies and the British government had grown impossible to ignore. Taxes imposed by the British Crown had angered many colonial leaders. Merchants complained that their trade was being controlled. Landowners argued that they were being ruled by a distant government that did not understand their lives. Across the colonies, men gathered in taverns, town halls, and private homes to debate what should be done. And in the small town of Sheffield, Massachusetts, one of the most important meeting places was the house of Colonel John Ashley. Ashley was a respected figure in the region. His home often served as a gathering point for influential men who wanted to discuss politics and the future of the colonies. Landowners, lawyers, and local leaders would sit together for hours, arguing over ideas about rights, government, and freedom. For them, these discussions felt revolutionary. For Bett, they were something else entirely. As a servant in the Ashley household, Bett moved quietly through the rooms where these conversations took place. She carried food to the table, poured drinks, cleared plates, and cleaned the floors after the guests had gone. She was expected to be invisible, but invisibility often comes with an unexpected advantage. People forget that someone is listening. Bett heard far more than the men in that room ever realized. She heard their anger toward the British government. She heard them complain about unfair laws and the abuse of power. Again and again, the same idea appeared in their conversations: freedom. The men spoke about liberty as though it were the most important principle in the world. They insisted that every man had natural rights, rights that no king should be allowed to take away. To them, these words described their own struggle. But Bett must have noticed the contradiction. While these men demanded freedom for themselves, they continued to live in comfortable houses built on the labor of enslaved people. She stood only a few feet away while they talked about liberty. And yet, no one in that room believed the word applied to her. Still, Bett listened. She watched. And she remembered every word. What the men in that house did not know was that the ideas they were discussing so confidently were slowly taking root in the mind of someone they had never considered an equal, someone who had spent her entire life in chains. Within a few years, those same ideas would become the foundation of one of the most extraordinary legal battles in early American history. But the moment that truly changed Bett's life had not happened yet. It would begin with a meeting held inside the very house where she was still enslaved, a meeting that would produce a document whose words would echo far beyond the walls of the Ashley home. In January of 1773, a group of influential men gathered once again inside the Ashley house in Sheffield. This was not an ordinary meeting. The tension between the American colonies and Britain had grown sharper with every passing year. Many colonial leaders believed the British government had begun to treat them as subjects rather than citizens. Taxes were rising, trade was being restricted, and the colonies had little representation in the decisions that affected their lives. Across Massachusetts, anger was building. The men who assembled in Colonel John Ashley's home that winter intended to put their beliefs into writing. Among those present was a young lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick. He was still early in his career, but already known as a sharp legal mind. During that gathering, Sedgwick helped draft what would later be called the Sheffield Declaration. The document was bold for its time. It argued that human beings possessed natural rights that did not come from kings or governments, but from the very fact that they were human. One line in particular stood out. It declared that all people in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of one another. Those words carried enormous weight. Years later, similar language would appear in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, one of the most famous political documents in history. But on that winter day in Sheffield, the ideas were still new. Inside the Ashley house, the men debated, wrote, and revised their arguments. They believed they were taking an important step toward defining the principles of a new society, one built on liberty and justice. Meanwhile, just outside those discussions, the household continued its normal routine. Food had to be prepared, rooms had to be cleaned, guests had to be served. Bett moved quietly through the house as she always did. She carried dishes into the rooms where the men were speaking. She passed through doorways while their voices echoed through the halls, and she heard their words. Words about freedom, words about equality, words about the natural rights of human beings. For Bett, the moment must have been deeply confusing. Here were powerful men declaring that no person should be denied their liberty, yet they were speaking those words inside a house where enslaved people worked from dawn until night. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The language of freedom was being written just a few steps away from someone who had never known freedom in her entire life. The men writing the Sheffield Declaration probably never imagined that their words would one day be used against the very system they accepted as normal. But Bett was listening carefully, and something inside her began to change. Because once a person hears the language of freedom, it becomes very difficult to forget it. The words spoken in that house in 1773 would remain in Bett's memory for years, waiting, until the moment came when she decided to test whether those promises meant anything at all. Teep Theo Kung Suan, 3000 Ki Tu. Episode 3, Part 3, The Question That Would Not Go Away. After the meeting in the Ashley house, life seemed to return to normal. The men who had gathered in Sheffield went back to their farms, businesses, and political duties. The document they had written, the Sheffield Declaration, began circulating among colonial leaders who shared the same frustrations with British rule. For them, it was another step in a growing political movement. For Bett, however, something had changed. The words she had heard that winter refused to leave her mind. All people are equal, free, independent. She had heard the sentence more than once as the men discussed and revised the document. They spoke it confidently, as though it described a simple and obvious truth. But Bett knew that truth did not exist in the world she lived in. Every morning she still woke before sunrise. Every day she still worked under the authority of people who believed they owned her life. She had no right to decide where she lived, what work she did, or what would happen to her child. And yet the men in the Ashley house insisted that liberty was the natural right of every human being. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Outside the Ashley household, events in the colonies were moving quickly. Later that same year, in December 1773, a dramatic protest took place in the city of Boston. A group of colonists boarded British ships in the harbor and threw large shipments of tea into the water. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. It shocked the British government and pushed the colonies even closer to open conflict. Within 2 years, the tension finally exploded. In the spring of 1775, fighting broke out between colonial militia and British troops. What began as a political dispute had turned into war. The American Revolutionary War had begun. Across the colonies, men picked up weapons and marched to fight for independence. They believed they were risking their lives for the right to govern themselves, for the promise of liberty. But while the war raged, Bett's life remained unchanged. She was still a slave in the Ashley household. She watched men leave to fight for freedom while she continued to live without it. The irony could not have been clearer. For years, Bett kept her thoughts to herself. Speaking openly about freedom could have been dangerous for someone in her position, but the idea had taken root. Every time she heard the word liberty, the same question returned. If freedom truly belonged to every human being, then why did it not belong to her? For a long time, the question remained only in her mind. But in the coming years, something extraordinary would happen, something that would give Bett the opportunity to turn that question into a challenge directed at the law itself. And when that moment arrived, she would do something almost no enslaved person had ever dared to attempt. She would demand that the promises of freedom apply to her too. As the American Revolutionary War spread across the colonies, the world outside the Ashley household was changing rapidly. Battles were being fought in towns and fields across North America. Colonial militias clashed with British troops. Armies marched through villages that had once been quiet farming communities. Men spoke passionately about liberty, independence, and the birth of a new nation. In 1776, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia and approved a document that would become one of the most famous political declarations in history, the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it contained a sentence that would echo across centuries: "All men are created equal." For the colonists fighting against Britain, those words captured the spirit of their struggle. They believed they were breaking free from tyranny and building a country based on the rights of individuals. But the reality of the new nation was far more complicated. Even as the Declaration of Independence was celebrated, slavery still existed in many parts of America. Thousands of men, women, and children remained in bondage, including Bett. While the colonies fought for freedom, Bett continued her daily routine inside the Ashley home. She still rose before dawn. She still served meals and cleaned rooms. She still lived under the authority of the people who owned her. Outside, soldiers fought for liberty. Inside the house, Bett remained a slave. The war dragged on for several difficult years. Battles were fought across the colonies, and many families were torn apart as men left to serve in the army. But by the early 1780s, the outcome of the war was becoming clearer. The colonies were moving closer to victory. As the new United States began to take shape, individual states started writing their own constitutions, documents that would define their laws and the rights of their citizens. In 1780, the state of Massachusetts adopted a new constitution. Like the earlier declarations of liberty, this document contained powerful language about human rights. One passage declared that all people are born free and equal, and that they possess natural rights that cannot be taken away. For many citizens of Massachusetts, those words represented the ideals of the new nation. But for someone like Bett, they meant something else entirely. Because if the law now claimed that every person was born free, then the system that had controlled her entire life suddenly looked very different. The ideas that Bett had heard years earlier in the Ashley house were no longer just political arguments. They were now part of the law. And for the first time in her life, Bett began to wonder whether those words might offer a path to something she had never truly possessed: freedom. Soon, she would decide to test whether the promises written in that Constitution meant what they claimed. And when she did, she would take a step that shocked the people around her and changed the course of history. By the early 1780s, the language of liberty was everywhere in Massachusetts. The Revolutionary War had pushed the colonies toward independence, and the new Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 had written powerful promises into law. It declared that all people were born free and equal, and that every person possessed natural rights, rights that could not simply be taken away. For most citizens, those words were political ideals. For Bett, they sounded like something far more personal. She had spent nearly 30 years in slavery. For 3 decades, she had lived under the authority of other people, forced to work in their household and obey their commands. But now, the law itself seemed to be saying something very different. If every person was born free, then how could slavery still exist? The thought would have been dangerous for an enslaved woman to express openly. Challenging the system that controlled her life carried serious risks. Slaveholders expected obedience, not arguments about rights. Yet Bett had never been someone who ignored injustice when she saw it. Years earlier, she had stepped between her sister Lizzie and a burning shovel, taking the blow meant for someone else. That instinct, the refusal to stand aside when something was wrong, still lived inside her. Now she began to consider a bold possibility. If the law claimed that freedom belonged to all people, perhaps the law could also recognize her freedom. At some point around 1781, Bett decided to seek help from someone who understood the legal system. She went to see Theodore Sedgwick, the same young lawyer who years earlier had helped write the Sheffield Declaration in the Ashley house. By then, Sedgwick had become a respected attorney in Massachusetts and was deeply involved in the political debates of the new nation. According to later accounts, Bett approached him with a simple but powerful question. She had heard the new Constitution being discussed, and she knew what it said. So she asked him directly, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are created equal and every man has a right to freedom. I am not a dumb creature. Won't the law give me my freedom?" The question forced Sedgwick to confront the contradiction that many Americans preferred to ignore. If the Constitution truly meant what it said, then slavery in Massachusetts might already be illegal. Sedgwick agreed to take the case. It was an extraordinary decision. Few enslaved people had ever attempted to challenge their status through the courts. The legal system was not designed for them, and most lacked the resources or support needed to pursue such a fight. But Bett was determined, and Sedgwick believed the law might actually be on her side. Together, they prepared to do something that had almost never been attempted before in the new United States. They would bring the question of slavery itself into a courtroom, and once the case began, the entire state would be forced to confront the meaning of its own words about freedom. Once Theodore Sedgwick agreed to help Bett, the idea of challenging her slavery moved from a private conversation to a legal strategy. But such a case needed to be carefully prepared. In the late 18th century, the legal system offered very few protections for women and even fewer for enslaved people. Bett's claim to freedom would already be considered unusual, and many people doubted whether a court would even take such a case seriously. To strengthen the argument, Sedgwick decided that Bett would not stand alone. Another enslaved person from the Ashley household would join the case. His name was Brom. Like Bett, Brom had spent years working under the authority of Colonel John Ashley. He lived within the same system of forced labor and had no legal control over his own life. By adding Brom to the case, Sedgwick hoped to give the legal challenge more weight. 2 plaintiffs would make the argument stronger, and at the time, male voices often carried greater authority in court proceedings. Together, the case would be known as Brom and Bett v. Ashley. Sedgwick, also brought in another highly respected lawyer to assist him, Tapping Reeve, a well-known attorney and the founder of the Litchfield Law School in Connecticut. Reeve was considered one of the most capable legal minds in the region, and his involvement signaled that this was not a minor dispute. This was a serious legal challenge. Their argument was built on a simple but powerful idea. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 declared that all people were born free and equal. If that statement was truly part of the law, then the institution of slavery itself could not legally exist within the state. Therefore, Bett and Brom argued that they were being illegally held in bondage. Colonel John Ashley, of course, strongly disagreed. From his perspective, Bett and Brom were not slaves in the way people often imagined slavery. Instead, he claimed they were simply household servants who lived under his protection and had nowhere else to go. This argument was common in the late 18th century. Many slaveholders attempted to soften the language of slavery by describing enslaved people as dependents or servants rather than property. But Bett and Brom's lawyers insisted that the reality was very different. They had been forced to work without pay. They could not leave the household. They had no control over their own lives. In every meaningful way, they were slaves. The case was scheduled to be heard in August of 1781 at the County Court of Common Pleas in the town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts. For Bett, the moment was extraordinary. A woman who had been born into slavery, who had never learned to read or write, was about to stand in a courtroom and challenge the authority of the man who claimed to own her. The outcome was far from certain. If the court rejected her argument, Bett could be forced to return to the Ashley household and continue living as she always had. But if the court accepted her claim, then the words written into the Massachusetts Constitution might suddenly become something real, not just for Bett, but for many others living in bondage across the state. And soon, a group of judges would have to decide whether the promise of freedom applied only to powerful men or to everyone. In August of 1781, the quiet town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, became the stage for a legal battle unlike any the region had seen before. The County Court of Common Pleas was preparing to hear the case of Brom and Bett v. Ashley. For most people in the courtroom that day, it may have seemed like just another legal dispute. But the question at the center of the case was far larger than a disagreement between a master and his servants. It was a question about the meaning of freedom itself. Bett and Brom arrived not as property, but as plaintiffs individuals, asking the court to recognize their rights under the law. That alone was extraordinary. In a society where enslaved people were rarely allowed to speak for themselves, their presence in court challenged long-standing assumptions about who had the right to seek justice. Standing beside them were their lawyers. Theodore Sedgwick, the same attorney who had agreed to take Bett's case after hearing her bold question about freedom, was ready to present the argument. Alongside him was Tapping Reeve, a respected legal scholar and founder of the Litchfield Law School. Together, they formed one of the most formidable legal teams in Massachusetts. Their strategy was clear. They would not simply argue that Bett and Brom deserved better treatment. They would argue that the entire institution holding them in bondage was illegal under the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. That constitution contained a powerful statement: all people are born free and equal and possess certain natural rights that cannot be taken away. The forgotten slave tale we, Sedgwick and Reeve, believed those words had legal force. If the Constitution truly meant what it said, then slavery could not legally exist in Massachusetts. Their argument turned the state's own founding principles into a weapon against the system of slavery. Across the courtroom sat Colonel John Ashley, the man who had controlled Bett's life for nearly 3 decades. As a respected landowner and influential figure in the community, Ashley was used to authority. Being challenged by people he considered his servants was something he likely never expected. Ashley's defense relied on a familiar claim. He argued that Bett and Brom were not slaves in the harsh sense people associated with plantations. Instead, he described them as members of his household servants who were cared for and protected under his authority. It was an argument designed to soften the reality of their situation, but the facts told a different story. Bett and Brom had worked for years without wages. They had no freedom to leave. They had no legal control over their own lives. In every practical sense, they were enslaved. As the lawyers presented their arguments, the judges and jurors faced a difficult decision. If they ruled in favor of Ashley, the system of slavery would continue unchanged. But if they ruled in favor of Bett and Brom, they would be acknowledging that the new Constitution had already made slavery incompatible with the law. The stakes were enormous, because this case was no longer just about two individuals seeking freedom. It was about whether the promises written into the founding principles of Massachusetts would actually be honored. And for the first time in her life, Bett was standing in a place where those promises might finally be tested. Inside the courtroom in Great Barrington, the case slowly unfolded. Lawyers spoke, witnesses were heard, and the central question remained clear. Could slavery legally exist in Massachusetts after the adoption of the state constitution in 1780? For Theodore Sedgwick and Tapping Reeve, the answer was simple: no. They argued that the language of the Massachusetts Constitution was not just poetic or symbolic, it was law. And the law declared that all people are born free and equal and possess natural rights that cannot be taken away. If those words were to mean anything, Sedgwick insisted, they had to apply to everyone, not only to wealthy landowners, not only to political leaders, but also to people like Bett and Brom. Their argument forced the court to confront a powerful contradiction. Massachusetts had just helped create a new nation built on the idea of liberty. Its leaders spoke constantly about freedom, justice, and equality. Yet within the same state, human beings were still being treated as property. Sedgwick's strategy was not to ask for sympathy. He asked the judges and jurors to look at the law itself. If Bett had been born a slave decades earlier, that fact did not change the meaning of the new Constitution. Laws could transform societies, and the Constitution had already declared that every person possessed the right to liberty. Therefore, he argued, Bett and Brom were being illegally held in bondage. Across the courtroom, Colonel John Ashley's defense attempted to weaken that claim. Ashley's lawyers argued that Bett and Brom were not slaves in the brutal sense commonly associated with plantations in the South. Instead, they described them as servants living under Ashley's care. According to this argument, they were not prisoners but members of the household who depended on their master for protection and stability. This defense reflected a common strategy used by slaveholders in northern colonies. By framing enslaved people as dependents rather than property, slave owners hoped to avoid confronting the deeper moral and legal questions raised by the Constitution. But the reality of Bett's life told another story. For nearly 30 years, she had been forced to work without pay. She could not choose where to live. She could not leave the Ashley household. Her labor and her life were controlled by someone else. That was not servitude. That was slavery. The jurors listening to the arguments had to decide which interpretation made more sense, the language of the Constitution or the tradition that had allowed slavery to exist for generations. For Bett, the moment must have felt both terrifying and extraordinary. She had been born into a system that told her she had no rights at all. Now, that same system was being asked to recognize her freedom, and soon the court would deliver its answer. After the arguments were presented and the evidence was heard, the courtroom in Great Barrington fell into a tense silence. The decision now rested with the jury. For Bett and Brom, everything depended on what those jurors believed about the meaning of the law. If the court ruled against them, their lives would return to exactly what they had always been, years of labor under the authority of Colonel John Ashley. But if the court ruled in their favor, something extraordinary would happen. Two people who had been born into slavery would walk out of the courtroom free. The jurors withdrew to deliberate. No one knows exactly how long their discussion lasted, but the question before them was larger than the fate of two individuals. They were being asked to interpret the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, a document that declared all people were born free and equal and possessed natural rights that could not be taken away. Did those words truly apply to everyone, or only to certain members of society? When the jury returned to the courtroom, the answer became clear. They ruled in favor of Bett and Brom. The verdict stated that the two plaintiffs were being illegally held in bondage. Colonel John Ashley was ordered to release them from his authority immediately. But the decision did not stop there. The court also required Ashley to pay damages to Bett and Brom as compensation for the labor they had been forced to provide for years without wages. It was a stunning outcome. In that moment, Bett achieved something that almost no enslaved person had managed to do in the early United States. She had used the law itself to claim her freedom. Historians would later recognize this victory as one of the earliest legal confirmations that slavery could not exist under the Massachusetts Constitution. Bett's case, combined with other legal challenges of the time, helped push the state toward the eventual end of slavery. For Bett, however, the meaning of the verdict was far more personal. After nearly 30 years in bondage, she was no longer someone's property. She was a free woman. The courtroom decision marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. But freedom did not mean that Bett's story was finished. In fact, the years that followed would reveal a new chapter, one in which she would build a life on her own terms and adopt the name by which history would remember her: Elizabeth Freeman. The courtroom verdict in 1781 had changed everything. For nearly 30 years, Bett had lived under the authority of Colonel John Ashley. Her work, her time, even the direction of her life had belonged to someone else. Now, with a single decision from the court, that system had been broken. Bett walked out of the courthouse in Great Barrington, no longer a slave. She was a free woman, but freedom in the late 18th century did not automatically mean security. Many formerly enslaved people faced a difficult reality once they were released from bondage. They had little money, few possessions, and often nowhere permanent to live. Work still had to be found, food still had to be earned, and survival in a new nation was not easy, even for those who had always been free. After the verdict, Colonel John Ashley made an offer. Despite the legal defeat, Ashley proposed that Bett and Brom could remain in his household this time as paid servants rather than slaves. In many ways, this was a common outcome for freed people during that period. Former masters sometimes offered wages to the same individuals who had once worked without pay. From Ashley's perspective, it may have seemed practical. Bett and Brom already knew the routines of the household, and replacing experienced workers was not always easy. But Bett refused. For most of her life, she had lived under Ashley's authority. She had worked in his house, endured the cruelty of his household, and carried the scar from the burning shovel that had struck her arm years earlier. Returning to that same environment, even with wages, was something she did not want. Instead, Bett chose a different path. She accepted a position working for the man who had helped secure her freedom, Theodore Sedgwick. Sedgwick and his wife Pamela welcomed Bett into their household. Unlike her previous life, this arrangement was based on employment rather than ownership. Bett would receive wages for her work, and she would have far more control over her own life. Over time, Bett became an important and trusted member of the Sedgwick household. She helped care for the children of the family, often acting as a nurse and caretaker. The Sedgwick children grew up knowing her not as a servant in chains, but as a respected presence in their home. It was during these years that Bett began to be known by a new nickname. The children affectionately called her Mum Bett. The name reflected the role she played in their lives, part caretaker, part family member. But Bett herself also chose something else during this period. After winning her freedom in court, she adopted a new surname. She called herself Freeman. From that moment forward, she would be known in history as Elizabeth Freeman. The name carried a powerful meaning. It was not given to her by a master. She chose it herself as a declaration of the life she had fought to claim. And while Bett was building her new life, the impact of her court victory was beginning to spread far beyond the Sedgwick household. Because the case of Brom and Bett v. Ashley had raised a question that Massachusetts could no longer ignore. If the Constitution truly declared that all people were born free, then how could slavery continue to exist in the state at all? For the first time in her life, Elizabeth Freeman was living under her own name. The decision to adopt the surname Freeman was more than a simple change of identity. It was a statement, a quiet but powerful declaration of what she had fought to become. For nearly 30 years, Bett had lived without control over her own life. Even her name had been shaped by the people who owned her. But now, she had chosen a name that reflected the truth of her new reality. She was no longer someone's property. She was free. Inside the Sedgwick household, Elizabeth Freeman began building a life that looked very different from the one she had known before. Her work there was still demanding, but the nature of it had changed. Quote, "She was no longer forced to labor without pay or under threat of punishment. Instead, she was employed as a paid domestic worker, responsible for helping manage the household and caring for the Sedgwick children. Over time, she became a deeply trusted presence in the family. The Sedgwick children grew up under her care, and many of them later spoke warmly about her influence in their lives. They remembered her not only as someone who helped raise them, but as a woman of remarkable strength, intelligence, and dignity. Her nickname, Mum Bett, reflected that relationship. To the children, she was more than a servant. She was a caregiver, a protector, and a steady presence in their home. The name carried affection and respect, and within the household, Elizabeth Freeman earned a reputation for reliability and wisdom. Though she had never learned to read or write, people around her recognized that she possessed a sharp mind and strong judgment. Years of observing the world carefully had given her a deep understanding of human nature. But working for the Sedgwick family was not the only role she played in the community. Elizabeth Freeman also developed a second calling. She became known locally as a healer and midwife. In the 18th century, medical care in rural towns often relied on individuals with practical experience rather than formal training. Women like Freeman, who had knowledge of herbal remedies, childbirth, and nursing, were often called upon to help neighbors during illness or childbirth. Freeman proved remarkably skilled in this work. People from nearby communities began seeking her help when family members were sick or when a baby was about to be born. She cared for the ill, assisted mothers during labor, and provided practical medical support in an era when professional doctors were not always available. Through this work, Elizabeth Freeman built something she had never been allowed to possess before: independence. She earned wages, saved money, and gradually established a reputation in the region as a capable and respected woman. But while Freeman was building her life in freedom, the legal ripple effects of her court victory were continuing to spread across Massachusetts, because the question raised by her case had not disappeared. If the Constitution said that every person was born free and equal, then the courts would soon have to decide whether slavery itself could survive under that law. While Elizabeth Freeman was quietly building a new life in the Sedgwick household, the consequences of her courtroom victory were spreading far beyond the town of Sheffield. The case of Brom and Bett versus Ashley had done something unusual. It had forced the legal system of Massachusetts to confront a question many people had avoided for years. If the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 declared that all people were born free and equal, could slavery still legally exist in the state? Freeman's case was not the only challenge appearing in the courts during those years. Around the same time, another enslaved man named Quock Walker began pursuing his own legal battle for freedom. Walker had been promised liberty by a previous master, but was later forced back into bondage by another man who claimed ownership over him. Walker refused to accept that fate, Like Freeman, he brought his case into the legal system, arguing that the new Constitution made slavery incompatible with the law. His struggle resulted in a series of trials that would later become known collectively as the Quackwalker cases. Together, these lawsuits began to reshape the legal understanding of slavery in Massachusetts. Judges, juries, and lawyers across the state were now confronting the same problem again and again. The Constitution's language about freedom and equality seemed to contradict the continued existence of slavery. Gradually, the courts began leaning toward a powerful conclusion. If every person truly possessed the right to liberty, then the institution of slavery could not survive within the boundaries of Massachusetts law. In 1783, just 2 years after Elizabeth Freeman's victory in court, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court effectively confirmed that interpretation. Through decisions connected to the Walker cases, the court declared that slavery was incompatible with the state constitution. With that ruling, slavery in Massachusetts came to an end. Unlike in many other places, the institution did not disappear through a single dramatic law passed by the legislature. Instead, it collapsed under the weight of the Constitution's own promises that people like Elizabeth Freeman had forced the courts to confront. The impact of this change became clear only a few years later. When the first United States Census was conducted in 1790, officials recorded the population of every state in the new nation. In Massachusetts, the census reported something remarkable. There were no enslaved people listed at all. The state had become one of the earliest places in the United States where slavery effectively disappeared. Elizabeth Freeman did not set out to transform the legal system of an entire state. She had simply asked a question about her own freedom. But by demanding that the law apply to her, she had helped expose the contradiction at the heart of the new nation's promises. And in doing so, she had helped push Massachusetts toward becoming one of the first truly free states in America. Meanwhile, Freeman herself continued living the life she had fought so hard to claim a life built on work, independence, and the quiet dignity of someone who had once challenged a system that seemed impossible to defeat. By the late 1780s, Elizabeth Freeman had spent several years living as a free woman. The transformation in her life was remarkable. For nearly 3 decades, she had lived under the authority of others, forced to work without pay, and denied the most basic rights. Now she was earning her own income, making her own decisions, and building a reputation throughout her community. Inside the Sedgwick household, Freeman remained an important and trusted presence. She continued caring for the Sedgwick children, helping guide them through their early years. Many of those children would later grow up to become well-known figures in American society. One of them, Catherine Sedgwick, would eventually become a respected writer who later helped preserve Freeman's story for future generations. But at the time, Freeman's influence in the household was far more personal. She was not just a worker completing daily tasks. She had become someone the family relied upon, a woman known for her discipline, intelligence, and strong moral character. Even though she had never received a formal education, Freeman possessed a kind of practical wisdom that people around her respected deeply. At the same time, her reputation as a healer and midwife continued to grow. In rural Massachusetts during the late 18th century, medical knowledge was often passed through experience rather than formal schooling. Communities depended on people who had learned through observation, practice, and tradition. Freeman became one of those trusted figures. When neighbors fell ill, she was sometimes called to help care for them. When a woman was about to give birth, Freeman's skills as a midwife could mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. Her work extended far beyond the Sedgwick household. Families in nearby towns came to respect her abilities, and many relied on her knowledge of remedies, nursing, and childbirth. Through these efforts, Freeman earned not only wages but also something she had rarely been granted during her earlier life: respect. People no longer saw her as property. They saw her as a capable and reliable member of the community. Over time, the money she earned from her work allowed Freeman to do something that would have once seemed impossible. She began saving enough to purchase her own home. For someone who had been born into slavery, a system that denied even the idea of ownership, the act of owning property represented a powerful symbol of independence. It was proof that the life she had fought for was not just temporary, it was real. And as the years continued to pass, Elizabeth Freeman slowly built a future that had once been completely out of reach. A life defined not by chains, but by the choices she made for herself. As the years passed, Elizabeth Freeman continued to build the life she had once only imagined. Working in the Sedgwick household gave her stability, but it was her reputation in the wider community that truly strengthened her independence. Families throughout the region trusted her skills as a nurse, healer, and midwife. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and practical medicine made her an important figure in a time when professional doctors were often far away. Whenever illness struck a household or a child was about to be born, someone might ride through the countryside to find her, and again, Elizabeth Freeman answered those calls. Through this work, she earned steady wages, something that had been impossible during the decades she had spent in slavery. Slowly, carefully, she began to save money. Saving money may seem ordinary today, but for Freeman, it represented something extraordinary. For most of her life, she had not been allowed to own anything. Her labor had belonged to someone else. Her time had belonged to someone else. Even the direction of her life had been decided by others. Now she was earning her own income and deciding how to use it. Eventually, Freeman managed to do something that few formerly enslaved people of her time achieved. She bought her own home. The house stood on Cherry Hill, in the town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It was not a grand estate like the homes of wealthy landowners, but it was something far more meaningful to her. It was hers. For the first time in her life, Freeman lived in a place where no one could order her away, sell her, or control her daily existence. She had built a home through her own labor. By the early 19th century, many of the Sedgwick children she had helped raise were now adults. They had grown into their own careers and families, and they no longer needed the constant care of a nurse. Freeman gradually stepped back from her role in the household. Instead, she moved into her home on Cherry Hill and began spending more time with her own family. Her daughter lived nearby and had children of her own. That meant Freeman, who had once feared losing her child in slavery, could now spend her later years surrounded by grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. It was a peaceful chapter of life, something she had never been guaranteed. Years earlier, she had taken an enormous risk by challenging the system that held her in bondage. The outcome could easily have been different. But now, as she grew older, Freeman could look around at the life she had built and see something that had once seemed impossible. A home, a family, and the freedom she had claimed with her own courage. Yet even as she lived quietly in Stockbridge, the story of the woman once called Mum Bett was slowly becoming part of a much larger history, the story of how the promise of freedom in America had begun to face its first real tests. As the years passed, Elizabeth Freeman lived quietly in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, surrounded by family and the community that had come to respect her. She was no longer the young woman who had once stood in a courtroom demanding her freedom. Age had softened the physical strength she once relied on, but the dignity and determination that defined her character remained just as strong. Those who met her often noticed something striking. Elizabeth Freeman carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she had overcome. She had been born into slavery, denied an education, and forced to labor for decades without pay. Yet she had challenged that system in court and won. Stories about her life began circulating among the people who knew her. Neighbors spoke about the woman who had taken her master to court. Families remembered the midwife who had helped deliver their children. Former members of the Sedgwick household spoke of the strength and wisdom she had shown while raising the family's children. One person who helped preserve Freeman's story was Catherine Sedgwick, the daughter of Theodore Sedgwick. As a child, Catherine had grown up under Freeman's care. She remembered the woman everyone called Mum Bett, not as a servant, but as a guiding figure in her childhood. Years later, Catherine would become a well-known American writer. In 1853, long after Freeman had passed away, she published a work describing the history of slavery in New England and the remarkable life of the woman who had once lived in her family's home. Through Catherine's writing and other accounts passed down over time, historians were able to reconstruct the story of Elizabeth Freeman, a woman who had once been invisible in the records of colonial America. But the truth was that Freeman herself had never sought fame. She had not fought for freedom to become famous or remembered. She had fought because she believed the law should recognize something simple, that she was a human being, and that human beings deserved to live free. In her later years, people sometimes asked Freeman what freedom meant to her after everything she had endured. Her answer revealed how deeply she understood the value of liberty. She once said that if, during her time as a slave, someone had offered her just 1 minute of freedom, even if she had been told she would die at the end of that minute, she would still have accepted it. Because even a single moment of freedom was worth more than a lifetime in chains. It was a powerful reflection from someone who had once lived in a world where freedom seemed impossible. But Elizabeth Freeman had proven that impossible things sometimes become reality when someone is brave enough to demand them. And after living a long life shaped by that courage, she would eventually reach the final chapter of her remarkable journey. By the early 19th century, Elizabeth Freeman had lived many years as a free woman. Her life had taken a path that few people born into slavery could have imagined. From a young girl forced to work in the Ashley household, she had become a respected member of the community in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. She had raised children, helped families through illness and childbirth, and built a home through her own labor. But even as her daily life became quieter, the meaning of what she had done years earlier continued to grow. Across the United States, the question of slavery had not disappeared. While Massachusetts and several northern states had begun moving away from the institution, slavery still existed in large parts of the country. In the southern states, it remained deeply connected to agriculture and the economy, and millions of people were still living in bondage. The new nation had been founded on ideals of liberty and equality, yet the reality of slavery continued to challenge those ideals. In this complicated world, the story of Elizabeth Freeman carried a special significance. She had not been a politician or a military leader. She had not written famous speeches or signed important documents. Instead, she had done something far simpler and in many ways far more powerful. She had taken the words written in the law and asked that they be applied to her. That act had forced the courts of Massachusetts to confront a contradiction between their principles and their practices. When the judges ruled in favor of Freeman and Brom, they were not just granting freedom to two individuals, they were confirming that the promises written into the state constitution had real meaning. Over time, historians would look back at that moment as one of the early steps in the long struggle to end slavery in America. But Freeman herself lived far from the political debates that continued to unfold across the country. In Stockbridge, she focused on the life she had built: her home, her family, and the community that had come to respect her. Neighbors knew her as a strong and dependable woman. Former members of the Sedgwick family remembered her as the caretaker who had helped guide their childhoods, and the people she had helped as a healer or midwife remembered her as someone who appeared when help was needed most. For Freeman, freedom was not an abstract political idea. It was something she experienced every day. It meant waking up in a house that belonged to her. It meant choosing the work she would do and the people she would help. It meant living without the fear that someone could claim ownership over her life again. After decades of bondage, those ordinary freedoms were extraordinary, and as the years passed, Elizabeth Freeman continued to live quietly in the town that had become her home, a living reminder that courage, even from someone the world had once ignored, could reshape history in ways no one expected. As the years passed, Elizabeth Freeman grew older in the quiet town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The long struggle that had once defined her life was now far behind her. The courtroom battles, the years of forced labor, and the moment when she stood before a judge demanding freedom had all become part of the past. What remained was the life she had built afterward. Freeman spent much of her later years in the home she had purchased on Cherry Hill. The house represented something deeply meaningful, not because it was large or impressive, but because it belonged to her. For a woman who had once been considered property, the ability to own property carried a powerful symbolism. It meant independence, it meant stability, and perhaps most importantly, it meant that no one could ever take away the life she had fought to claim. During these years, Freeman's world revolved around family. Her daughter lived nearby, and as time passed, grandchildren and even great-grandchildren became part of her life. The same woman who had once feared that slavery might separate her from her child was now able to watch her family grow across generations. The presence of children in her life must have carried special meaning. Years earlier, Freeman had helped raise the children of the Sedgwick family, caring for them as a nurse and caretaker. Those children had grown up and moved on to their own lives, but many of them never forgot the influence she had on them. Some visited her in later years. Others spoke about her with admiration and gratitude. Even though Freeman had never been formally educated, people around her often described her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and judgment. She had spent a lifetime observing the world carefully, and her experiences had given her a wisdom that many respected. By the time she reached old age, Freeman had lived through some of the most dramatic transformations in early American history. She had been born when the land was still part of the British Empire. She had witnessed the American Revolution, the birth of the United States, and the writing of laws that promised liberty to a new nation. And she had played a role perhaps larger than she ever expected in forcing those promises to be taken seriously. In December 1829, Elizabeth Freeman's long life came to an end. Because the exact year of her birth had never been recorded, historians cannot say her precise age, but it is believed that she was around 85 years old when she died. That meant something remarkable. She had spent more years living as a free woman than she had spent in slavery. Her life had begun in chains, but it had ended in freedom. When Elizabeth Freeman died in December 1829, the people who had known her understood that they were losing someone extraordinary. Her life had spanned nearly a century of American history. She had been born into slavery when the colonies were still under British rule, lived through the American Revolution, and witnessed the early decades of the new United States. But what made Freeman remarkable was not simply the time in which she lived. It was the courage she had shown within that time. After her passing, the Sedgwick family made a decision that reflected the deep respect they felt for her. Elizabeth Freeman was buried in the Sedgwick family plot in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The burial ground was normally reserved for members of the Sedgwick family themselves. Yet Freeman was laid to rest there as well, the only person outside the family to receive that honor. It was a powerful symbol of the bond that had developed between her and the household where she had worked for so many years. The Sedgwicks also placed an inscription on her grave that summarized the extraordinary life she had lived. The words on the marker told visitors that Elizabeth Freeman had been born a slave and had remained enslaved for nearly 30 years. It noted that she could neither read nor write, yet in her own sphere she had no superior and no equal. The inscription also praised her character. It described her as someone who never wasted time or property, someone who never betrayed a trust, and someone who always performed her duties faithfully. In times of hardship within the household, she had been remembered as both an efficient helper and a loyal friend. At the end of the inscription, the words read simply, "Good mother, farewell." Those words reflected how the people around her saw her, not merely as a former servant, but as a woman who had cared for others, guided children, and helped families through some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Even in death, Freeman remained connected to the family whose lives she had helped shape. Years earlier, when she had first arrived in the Ashley household as a young enslaved girl, no one could have imagined that her story would one day become part of American history. She had started life invisible to the world, yet by the time she died, Her courage had already helped change the course of the law in Massachusetts. And although her grave rested quietly in the hills of Stockbridge, the story of the woman, once known as Mum Bett, would continue to travel far beyond that small town, reminding future generations that the promise of freedom often begins with a single voice willing to challenge injustice. Long after Elizabeth Freeman had won her freedom and built a life in Massachusetts, the memory of her presence continued to live on in quiet but meaningful ways. One of the most remarkable reminders of her life appeared sometime around the year 1812. During that time, a member of the Sedgwick family, Susan Ridley Sedgwick, created a small portrait of Freeman. The artwork was not a large painting meant for public display. Instead, it was a delicate watercolor miniature painted on ivory, a common style for personal portraits in the early 19th century. By then, Freeman was already an elderly woman, believed to be around 70 years old. The portrait captured her face with careful detail. She appears calm and dignified, her expression steady and composed. There is no sign of the suffering she had endured during the decades she lived in slavery. Instead, the image reflects a woman who had lived long enough to see her struggle transformed into something meaningful. Today, historians believe this miniature portrait is the only known image of Elizabeth Freeman that still survives. It is preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it serves as a rare visual connection to someone whose story once seemed almost invisible in the written records of early America. Looking at the portrait today, it is easy to forget how unlikely it was that Freeman's image or her story would survive at all. Enslaved people in the 18th century were rarely recorded in official documents. Their lives were often reduced to simple notations in property records or estate inventories. Many passed through history, leaving almost no trace behind, but Freeman's life had disrupted that pattern. By challenging the legal system and forcing the courts to confront the meaning of freedom, she had ensured that her story would be remembered. Her portrait is more than just an image of an elderly woman. It represents a survivor, a woman who had once been treated as property but later stood before a court and demanded recognition as a human being. In the quiet details of that small painting, historians see a reminder that the struggle for freedom in America was not fought only by famous politicians or military leaders. Sometimes it was fought by people who had been ignored by history, people like Elizabeth Freeman, who transformed a life of silence into a moment of courage that helped reshape the law itself. And although the portrait captures her in old age, the story behind that face reaches back decades to a moment when she asked a simple but powerful question. If all people are born free, why was she still a slave? As the 19th century moved forward, the story of Elizabeth Freeman slowly began to find its place in American history. For many years after her death, her name was not widely known outside the communities of Western Massachusetts. She had not written books or delivered speeches, and the records of her life remained scattered across family memories and local documents. But among the people who had known her, the memory of Mum Bett never disappeared. Members of the Sedgwick family often spoke about the woman who had helped raise their children and guided their household with quiet strength. Her influence had been so significant that later generations continued to tell stories about her character and courage. One of the most important voices in preserving Freeman's story was Catherine Sedgwick. Catherine had grown up in the household where Elizabeth Freeman worked after gaining her freedom. As a child, she experienced Freeman not as a historical figure, but as a daily presence in her life, someone who cared for her, protected her, and offered guidance. When Catherine became an author later in life, she began writing about the history of slavery in New England, a subject many people in the region preferred not to discuss. In 1853, Catherine published a work describing aspects of that history. Within it, she included recollections of Elizabeth Freeman and the extraordinary moment when she had challenged the system that held her in bondage. Through these writings, Freeman's story reached a wider audience. Readers learned about the enslaved woman who had listened to men discussing liberty inside the Ashley House, and who later used those same ideas to claim her own freedom in court. Historians began to recognize the significance of her case. They understood that the lawsuit Mum and Bett v. Ashley had been one of the legal events that pushed Massachusetts toward the end of slavery. Alongside the famous Quock Walker cases, Freeman's victory helped demonstrate that the new Constitution's promise of freedom could not coexist with the institution of slavery. Over time, Elizabeth Freeman came to be remembered as a pioneer in the long struggle for civil rights in America. Some historians have even described her as the Rosa Parks of her time. Like Rosa Parks nearly 2 centuries later, Freeman had confronted a system that treated her as less than equal. And like Parks, she had forced the law to confront its own contradictions. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Freeman's legacy is how simple her challenge had been. She had not demanded special treatment. She had only asked that the law mean what it said. That freedom should belong to everyone. And because she dared to ask that question, the quiet life of a woman once called Mum Bett became part of a much larger story, the story of how America slowly began to face the gap between its ideals and its reality. By the time historians began studying the life of Elizabeth Freeman, the United States had already changed dramatically. Decades after her death, the country would face a brutal civil war over the question of slavery. Millions of people would fight and die before the institution was finally abolished across the entire nation. Looking back at that long struggle, scholars began to recognize that the fight for freedom had not started with the Civil War. It had begun much earlier, often with individuals whose stories were almost forgotten. Elizabeth Freeman was one of those individuals. Her victory in 1781 had taken place at a time when the United States itself was still being formed. The ideas of liberty and equality were being written into constitutions and political declarations, but many Americans had not yet confronted what those promises meant for people living in bondage. Freeman forced that confrontation. She had not been a politician. She had not been wealthy or educated. She had not even been able to read the words written in the Constitution, yet she understood their meaning, and she understood that if those words were true, they had to apply to everyone. Her decision to challenge slavery in court created a ripple that spread far beyond her own life. The ruling in Mum and Bett versus Powell, Ashley helped push Massachusetts toward the legal conclusion that slavery could not exist under the state constitution. Only a few years later, by the time of the 1790 federal census, Massachusetts had become one of the first places in the United States where slavery had effectively disappeared. For historians, Freeman's case stands as an early example of how the law could be used to challenge injustice. But her legacy is not only about legal history, it is also about courage. Elizabeth Freeman lived in a society where enslaved people were expected to remain silent. The system depended on obedience and fear, yet she chose to ask a question that many others were afraid to voice. If the law said that all people were born free, then why was she still a slave? That question exposed a contradiction at the heart of early American society, a contradiction that the nation would continue struggling with for generations. Today, when people look back at the story of Elizabeth Freeman, they often see more than a legal case. They see the power of a single individual refusing to accept injustice as permanent, a woman who had been born invisible to history, but who changed history simply by demanding that the promise of freedom apply to her too. For most of her life, Elizabeth Freeman had lived in a world that rarely recorded the voices of people like her. She had been born into slavery in the mid-1700s, a time when enslaved people were often treated as invisible within the official records of society. Their names appeared occasionally in ledgers or property lists, but their thoughts, struggles, and stories were rarely written down. Freeman herself never learned to read or write, yet despite that silence, her life eventually became part of American history. The reason was simple. She had done something that forced the world around her to notice. When she walked into a courtroom in 1781 and challenged the authority of the man who claimed to own her, Elizabeth Freeman turned an invisible life into a moment that could not be ignored. Her victory in the case Mum and Bett versus Place. Ashley did more than free 2 individuals. It helped reveal the contradiction between the ideals of the new American nation and the reality that many people still lived in bondage. Those ideals had been written boldly into documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Massachusetts Constitution. They spoke of equality, natural rights, and liberty for all people. But Freeman's case forced the courts to answer a difficult question. If those principles truly defined the new nation, then how could slavery continue to exist? The legal decisions that followed her case helped push Massachusetts toward becoming one of the earliest places in the United States where slavery disappeared. In that sense, Freeman's challenge became part of a much larger transformation. Yet her own life remained remarkably humble. She did not travel across the country telling her story. She did not write speeches or lead political movements. Instead, she lived quietly in Stockbridge, raising her family, helping neighbors as a nurse and midwife, and earning respect through the everyday work of caring for others. Her courage had already spoken for itself. Years later, historians and writers would begin piecing together the details of her life. Through family memories, legal records, and local histories, the story of Elizabeth Freeman slowly emerged. What they discovered was the story of a woman who had taken the ideals of a new nation seriously, perhaps more seriously than the people who first wrote them. While others debated the meaning of liberty, Freeman demanded that liberty become real. And because of that determination, the name of a woman, once known only as Mum Bett, would eventually be remembered as part of the long American struggle to turn promises of freedom into reality. Among the many stories remembered about Elizabeth Freeman, one reflection captures the depth of what freedom meant to her. After spending nearly 30 years in slavery, Freeman understood liberty in a way that many others never could. For people who had always lived free, the word freedom could sound like an abstract idea, something discussed in speeches, laws, and political arguments. But for Freeman, freedom was not abstract. It was something she had once lived without. At some point during her later years, she shared a thought that historians would preserve as one of the most powerful reflections on her life. She said that if, while she was still enslaved, someone had offered her just 1 minute of freedom, even if she had been told she would die at the end of that single minute, she would still have accepted the offer. Because even 1 minute of living freely would have been worth it. She explained that she would have taken that chance simply to stand for a moment on the earth as a free woman. Those words reveal something profound about the life she had endured. For decades, her time had not belonged to her. Every hour of the day had been controlled by others. Her labor, her movements, even her future had been determined by people who believed they had the right to own her life. In such a world, even a single minute of freedom would have been priceless. Yet Freeman did not receive just 1 minute. She gained nearly half a lifetime. After winning her freedom in 1781, she lived for many more decades. Those years allowed her to build a home, raise her family, help neighbors in times of illness, and grow old surrounded by the people she loved. It was a life shaped by ordinary moments that had once been impossible, choosing where to live, deciding how to spend the day, working for her own benefit rather than someone else's. These simple freedoms were the very things she had fought to obtain, and perhaps that is why Freeman's story continues to resonate. She reminds us that freedom is not just a political principle written in constitutions or proclaimed in speeches. It is something deeply personal. It is the ability to live a life that belongs to you. For Elizabeth Freeman, that truth had been painfully clear long before the courts recognized it. And once she finally stood in the world as a free woman, she never forgot how precious that freedom truly was. The story of Elizabeth Freeman begins in silence, a girl born into slavery in the mid-1700s. No record of her birth, no education, no voice in the society around her. In the world she entered, people like her were not expected to shape history. They were expected to remain unseen, to live and die within a system that denied them the most basic rights. And yet, somehow, Elizabeth Freeman changed that expectation. She did not do it through political power or public speeches. She did not lead an army or write a famous declaration. Instead, she did something far simpler and far more dangerous for someone in her position. She asked a question. When she heard the words written into the new laws of Massachusetts, the promise that all people were born free and equal, she refused to accept that those words applied only to powerful men. She demanded that they apply to her. That demand brought her into a courtroom in 1781, standing against the man who had controlled her life for nearly 3 decades. It was a moment that could have ended very differently. The legal system of the time was not designed to protect people like her, but the law had made a promise, and Elizabeth Freeman insisted that promise be honored. When the court ruled in her favor, it did more than grant freedom to one woman and another enslaved man named Brom. The decision helped push Massachusetts toward recognizing that slavery itself could not exist under the principles written into its constitution. In that sense, Freeman's courage forced the young United States to confront a difficult truth. It is easy for a nation to declare that liberty belongs to everyone. It is far harder to make that declaration real. Elizabeth Freeman helped begin that process. Her life reminds us that the struggle for freedom in America has often been carried forward by individuals whose names rarely appear in textbooks, people who simply refuse to accept injustice as permanent. Today, more than 2 centuries later, her story continues to stand as a powerful example of how change sometimes begins, not with armies, not with revolutions, but with one person brave enough to ask whether the promises written into law actually mean what they say. Elizabeth Freeman was once an enslaved woman called Mum Bett, but by the end of her life, she had become something far greater. She became proof that even in the